Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the 7th episode of our 6th season of Diplomatic Immunity, looking at the geopolitical and economic fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today we'll be covering the effects of the war in Ukraine on military strategy and tactics. A conventional stalemate on the battlefield has forced both sides to change their tactics and reevaluate their military structures in the context of 21st century warfighting. With new technologies such as drones and electronic warfare, Russia and Ukraine are giving the world a glimpse of what a future conflict between great powers may look like, and actors like NATO and China are taking notice. What lessons are militaries taking away from more than 2 years of fighting in Ukraine, and how might that translate into conflict down the road? For answers to these questions and more, we turn to retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe. Welcome to Diplomatic Immunity.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
I'm delighted to be joined today by Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who, prior to retiring from the Armed Forces in 2018, served as Commanding General of the U.S. Army in Europe. He consults for several companies on Europe, NATO, and the European Union, and he is co-author of the book Future War and the Defense of Europe, published by Oxford University Press. General Hodges was most recently Senior Advisor to Human Rights First, a nonprofit, and was also the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Let's listen to the conversation. I'm excited to be joined today by retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges, thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm very grateful for the privilege. And this is probably as close as I could get to a high-level academic institution like Georgetown is through a podcast.
You give us too much credit. This will be great. I'm looking forward to it. So before we get into sort of February 24th, 2022, can you kind of set the stage for our listeners as what was the strategic defense, strategic deterrent, the military strategic outlook in Europe like in late 2021, early 2022, before Russia invaded Ukraine? You know, obviously, you know the US side and the European side well, but also what did we think the Russian view was as well before the war started?
So this war is what failed deterrence looks like. We failed, the West failed to understand and realize who Russia is and to really recognize the threat that Russia presented to all of us through multiple administrations, but at least going back to 2008 when we failed to respond to their invasion of Georgia, the Bush administration, and then we failed to respond when they jumped over President Obama's red line in Syria. And we failed still during the Obama administration when they invaded Ukraine in 2014. And we really did nothing. And the Trump administration did only two things with regards to Ukraine. And that was, number one, to finally make the decision to provide Javelin, which is not a strategic move, that's a policy decision. And also, of course, to try and get help from President Zelensky to interfere in our election. So that's been the extent of multiple U.S. administrations. And it stems from a naive, well-intentioned, but naive understanding of how to deal with Russia. Now, we're not alone in this. If you go back to the end of 21, I think the Russians were looking at all of us as they were trying to decide what they were going to do, and they could see that we were a mess. They could see in the United States the domestic problems, January 6th, the results of our election, the way that we came out of Afghanistan after 20 years, it ended in disaster. And of course, that disaster had multiple fathers also, but nonetheless, that's where we were in the U.S. President Macron had said NATO was brain dead. Germany was still building Nord Stream 2. So you could almost imagine the Russians saying, well, now's the time. Let's go ahead and finish the job in Ukraine because the West is not going to do anything about it. I mean, they may yell at us or a few more sanctions, but they're not going to do anything. And so that's why I think the Russians felt like they could go ahead, roll into Ukraine, and finish the job.
Well, and as we saw when they did, they rolled into Ukraine, but then that was it. There was all the talk was the war will be over in a few days. They'll be able to take Kyiv and this will be over quickly. But that wasn't the case. So can you kind of walk us through the first year of the war and why was Ukraine able to sort of withstand that initial blow? But then not only that, start to push the Russians back throughout 2022 to the point where when the counteroffensive took place in 2023, folks in the West, for better or worse, a lot of them were sort of expecting Ukraine to sort of then roll the Russians back out of Ukraine. How did 2022 sort of shake out from invasion to sort of the cold months setting in?
Well, certainly I was guilty of overestimating Russian capabilities. I was surprised, frankly, how poorly they did, how they continue the problems that they have. But I never believed that Ukraine was going to fall in 3 days. I mean, I had just been in Kyiv about 2 weeks before then as part of a small Track 1.5 delegation, along with 4 or 5 former ambassadors and another retired general officer. And our mission was to convey to the Ukrainians, to the government in Kyiv, hey, they're coming. You have got to get ready. And so fresh in my mind was the density of Kyiv itself. In the military, we would call urban terrain was very complex. It's not like Manhattan with, straight avenues and streets. It's the opposite. And it takes a lot of people to enter and clear large buildings and that sort of thing. And I thought, even if the Russians really did have 150,000 people, they could not take Kyiv by itself, even if there were no Ukrainian troops. And so I was sure the Ukrainians would do better than 3 days. I think what the Ukrainians did that was really important, of course, was their ability to use air defense in a way that was innovative tactically, not just the technical part, but the tactics of how they moved it around is what prevented Russia from ever gaining air superiority, even though Russia had enormous advantages in terms of number and quality of aircraft. But having a lot of aircraft does not equal having a great air force.
So you mentioned the tactics, though, but so what does that mean? Because that is a big part of this, the lack of air superiority. Was it literally just moving air defense systems around so they couldn't find them, or jamming signals, or?
It's a variety of things. The reason our Air Force is so good at achieving air superiority is because this is an operation. It's not just filling the sky with airplanes. It is a deliberate, planned effort where you go after the enemy's air defense, you go after the enemy's headquarters, the command and control, and you go after the enemy's airfields, the facilities. So you're not just shooting down enemy aircraft, you're eliminating the ability of your opponent to fight back. And of course, you also have to build in plans to go in and pick up down pilots, that sort of thing. None of that existed. I mean, the Russians flew in there as if they expected no opposition and started getting shot out of the sky. They didn't have a culture in the Air Force where they could rapidly adapt. I mean, even today, after 26 months, they have not destroyed a single train or convoy bringing ammunition and equipment from Poland into you. That's incredible. And the reason is they don't have this culture where they can because you don't have air superiority, you can't have your big AWACS type aircraft in the sky that could then direct strike aircraft towards a moving target. They're not able to do that. So that's what I mean. It was a large part of failure of the Russian side. But of course, the Ukrainians know the Russians. They understand they have the same equipment. They understand the tactics. They know who's who. And I think this was General Zaluzhny at the time made some very rapid decisions to get things in the right place, to protect his assets, but then to be able to use them in a way that shot down aircraft and scared away Russian Air Force.
So then, the first few days they were able to hold off the incoming invasion from Russia. I mean, there's a lot of different things that go into this, right? I mean, there's the training the Ukrainians had been receiving from the U.S. since, 2013, 2014. There's also you're fighting for your home. So that adds a little something to it. We talked a lot about, or I heard people talking a lot about the command and control system in Russia and the fact of the difference in the types of units and who controls them, and the decision-making flow in the Russian military really hindered them from what I've read out of this. But can you talk to that a little bit about sort of how that's different from sort of the Ukrainian model now, as opposed to the old Soviet model and our model?
Well, of course, most of the senior Ukrainian officers grew up in that Soviet system, went to Soviet schools. But we had Ukrainian troops had been with us in Iraq and Afghanistan for the past 20 years, exercises going on. So there was a Westernization, let's say. I don't want to overstate this. There's still vestiges of the old Soviet model that are still there, but particularly at the younger, more junior officer levels, there was a Westernization that had taken place. And so you had more of that. And General Zaluzhny himself, I believe he was predisposed to decentralization anyway. And he was in the process of trying to change that system within his own military when this all started. The reliance on top-down leadership and with the arrogance of the Russians coming in, they didn't bother to destroy the Ukrainian cellular network either. And I thought, well, that's what we do day one. You remember Colin Powell, you cut the head off. You take out command and control, you take out the communications capability. The Russians didn't do it because they were planning on using the Ukrainian network. And that's why you had so many Russian generals were killed in the early days, because they were yakking on their cell phone on the Ukrainian network. And it's, pretty short work to figure out who's there. And so they started getting hit. Now, they eventually learned from that, obviously, but those were indicators of the level of professional readiness that they did not have. And, even to this day, after over 2 years, every video I see of a tank getting destroyed or vehicles being destroyed, they're all sitting out in the wide open where Ray Charles could spot them. And these are things that, good sergeants don't let people do. They don't have that in their structure, that kind of culture of discipline either.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the type of fighting that's going on in Ukraine now, where there's even more eyes in the sky than there have been, where you've got a sergeant or even a lower rank on the other side that's flying a drone around with first-person view and stuff. And we'll get to that stuff in a little bit. But this war is very interesting in so many ways because there's aspects now of World War I. They're becoming more entrenched over the course of the last year. There was aspects earlier on of World War II with like massive tank warfare and maneuvers and things like that. But then you also have, the new tech, like the drones that I just mentioned that are involved in this. So what happened after the initial invasion? The Ukrainians are able to, take that blow, but then they're able to push the Russians back. What did that look like? What was sort of going on after that initial invasion?
Well, I think in the early stages, the Russians were not postured to take advantage of their mass, which is the one advantage that they still have. Because they had chosen to attack around the periphery of Ukraine, there was no main effort, there was no focused effort. Instead, it was multiple places entering from all points. And so they had not really developed a plan. And there are Russia experts that would say, well, that was because this was not drawn up by the general staff. This was an FSB operation because they really thought they were just going to show up. It took them a while to reorganize themselves. And in the meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers saw opportunity. They were able to exploit it, particularly up towards Kharkiv. In the South, they were not as successful trying to exploit that. And General Surovikin, was smart enough to, number one, begin preparation of defensive lines further to the east. And also, he had the clout or the ability to convince the general staff that they needed to pull out of Kherson. Now, he got sacked shortly after that, but he probably saved the Russian army by doing that. On the other hand, where we failed was on the strategic level. We never made the decision that we wanted Ukraine to win. I mean, you heard this nonsense about we're with them for as long as they take. We don't want Ukraine to lose. Russia has already lost strategically, and other nonsense statements that do not provide any strategic clarity. And if you don't have strategic clarity, you don't have good policy. There were these ridiculous arguments about, well, Abrams tank burns too much fuel, takes too long to train an F-16 pilot. We don't want to give them ATACMS because we don't have enough, and 5 other excuses. And all of those were just that. They were excuses because we had not figured out, or were not willing to say, that our strategic objective was help Ukraine defeat Russia. And so we're already in 2023 in this avoid escalation. We were terrified that Russia might use a nuclear weapon. And so that caused us to hesitate, and we gave Russians months to dig these enormous defenses and recover from the disasters they had there at the end of 22 in early 23. And then we all sat there and hoped that Ukraine would be successful in their counteroffensive. I believed that they would have more success, but I couldn't believe that the U.S. would take that long, that we would never commit to providing them what they needed. People that criticize Ukrainians for not launching their counteroffensive the way we would have done it, we would never send an American soldier in an attack without having already achieved total air superiority, overwhelming firepower, and significant engineering capabilities. So shame on us that this was our failure, not Ukrainian failure, that the counteroffensive ground to a halt.
So you mentioned the escalation fear. I remember that being talked about a lot. Should there have been a certain level of fear of that escalation, not knowing what Putin would do if he was, faced with losing, and that was something that potentially put his, regime at risk? What would he do if that was the case? If you could talk a little bit more about why you think the escalation fears were overblown.
Yeah, well, first of all, they started threatening the use of nuclear weapons from the very beginning. If we provided Stinger, a shoulder-fired air defense weapon, or if we provided Patriot, or if we provided Abrams, or if we provide ... They kept threatening nuclear weapons. And I think that when President Biden told them, said, look, if you use a nuclear weapon, you will suffer catastrophic consequences. And then President Xi, he even told the Russians, do not use nuclear weapons. And so then you start thinking, well, where would the Russians actually use a nuclear weapon? Against what? I mean, the Ukrainians said, that's not going to stop us. So you try to think where a tactical nuclear weapon might be employed anywhere in Ukraine that would change the outcome of the war. There is no place.
And that's because forces are dispersed. It's not like you're going to knock out the entire Ukrainian army with, one tactical nuke.
Exactly. And so from a practical standpoint, it makes no sense. From a strategic standpoint, it makes no sense because they would suffer catastrophic consequences. It would be very difficult for the Chinese to continue to support them, and that's been essential for them. And then you begin to realize they're not going to do it, that their nuclear weapons really are most effective when they don't use them, because they could see how we were terrified that they might use a nuclear weapon. And of course, they knew that we were reading their mail. They knew that we were hearing. And so this is basic counter espionage, is when you start feeding the fear of the enemy by leaking things or conversations that, oh, we're going to do this. It's such a shame. It's a wasted opportunity because the focus has been on limiting the potential for escalation versus helping Ukraine defeat Russia. At the end of the day, the president has a responsibility to clearly identify our strategic objective. And with a clearly defined objective and priorities, then you can develop effective policy. In the absence of that clearly defined objective, it's impossible or a good luck if you do come up with effective policy. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan and we only had a clear objective the first year.
You mentioned already the sort of trench warfare that we've gotten into now. Meet sort of today's tech, the GPS jamming capabilities of the Russians, the first-person view drones that make it even harder for soldiers to go out to try to clear mines, or all this different stuff. So can you walk us through sort of how those two are melding together on like a daily basis? If we were, a unit of Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, what does warfare look like in 2024 in eastern Ukraine right now?
Well, of course, you need the capability that helps you defeat the enemy's efforts. I listened to General Cavoli a little while back where he was talking about how Russia's only real advantage is mass, and that you can defeat mass with precision, because with precision, you can destroy their headquarters, their logistics, and their artillery. Without those three things, the mass is not effective, especially when it's untrained masses like what Russia is employing now. So long-range precision weapons that could reach out, because of drones, you can see and find everything, but the Ukrainians are not able to reach everything because the United States, this goes back to bad policy decisions, has resisted providing the 300-kilometer ATACMS, spent a long time resisting providing the ground-launched small diameter bomb, which is about 120 kilometers. The French and the British have provided Scalp and Storm Shadow, The Germans have resisted providing Taurus, which is a 500-kilometer cruise missile. So, because we have withheld the long-range capability, the Ukrainians have not been able to neutralize the advantage of mass. The Ukrainians have said, "Fine, we've got enough targets inside Russian-occupied Ukraine that we would not need to use ATACMS against targets inside Russia." I mean, 300 kilometers is not going to make that big a difference anyway. But if you can make Crimea untenable, if you can destroy Russian headquarters, Russian artillery, Russian logistics sites, I mean, that's going to make a big difference. No one weapon wins the war. But when you ask what does it look like now, in the absence of that long range fire, then you have to depend on regular cannon artillery that's out to between 20 and 50 kilometers, so 12 to 30 miles. We at least have provided some of the cluster munitions, the improved conventional munitions, which you've seen video of, I'm sure, and many of your listeners. This is an artillery round that goes out and it opens up and it drops lots of bomblets that are ideal against Russian attacks. And so cluster munitions have helped stem the tide. But when you start running out of those, then it becomes a real problem. And Ukrainian armed forces had to pull back from Avdiivka, not because they didn't have enough drones, but because they didn't have enough artillery ammunition.
And what is your view on the tech side of this, and how they're sort of adapting tech for the field and for what's happening? And more broadly than that, what have you learned, and what do you think U.S. planners are taking away from what they're seeing in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, credit to the Russians, first in their ability to dig in the famous Surovikin line that bought them time. And then secondly, they have achieved dominance in the air with drones. They have so many more drones. And they also continue to have dominance in terms of electronic warfare. They were always better than us during the Cold War. It just was never a core competency of ours like it is of theirs, and they still have that. And so when I talk to my Ukrainian friends in Ukrainian armed forces, they talk about how important it is that they figure out how to operate inside the context of Russian electronic warfare dominance. So a friend of mine sent me a picture today of his soldiers carrying man-portable jammers, like on their back, that would help jam to protect them from drones. This is a technology I would expect that we are working on ourselves to be able to counter drones. So the counter drone effort, ever since the first guy picked up a knife and the other guy picked up a shield, I mean, we've been doing this for millennia, and that's what's going on out there. If Ukrainians had enough long-range precision strike capability, they could hit the big Russian jammers. So I know I sound a little bit like a broken record, but this long-range precision is so important in modern warfare. And the U.S. Army knows that. I mean, we are transitioning from just cannon and rocket to longer-range precision strike capability.
And, on top of what the U.S. is sort of watching here and learning from in this war, the other big elephant in the room that we think about is China and what this might mean, what they're watching for in regards to, something happening in the South China Sea or with Taiwan. So, what do you think they are taking away from this? Both on the bigger level strategic picture, but also at the tactical level.
I think the Chinese are three or four things that they're considering now. Number one, they're looking at how squeamish the U.S. is about nuclear weapons. Now, the second thing is they've got to be making a strategic calculation about our willingness to do what we say we're going to do. I mean, this phrase, the international rules-based order, doesn't roll off the tongue very well, but what we're talking about, of course, is respect for sovereignty, respect for freedom of navigation, respect for international law, respect for human rights. If we're not willing to defend that in Europe, where it's much easier to do it, I think the Chinese could walk away from this thinking the U.S. doesn't have the will to actually do it in the Indo-Pacific region. So that's a very dangerous set of circumstances for us, and why I think helping Ukraine defeat Russia is very much a part of deterring China. Now, at the operational level, they will have seen that we have enormous logistics capability. When we put our mind to it, we can bring a lot of stuff, whether it's by air or sea. That's always been the challenge in the Pacific is the gigantic distances. But still, Taiwan is not very close to U.S. bases. So South Korea, Japan, these obviously are important. There's a reason we've stayed there for the last 60, 70, 80 years, but they are also within range of weapons coming out of North Korea. And so that'll be part of the calculation. And then finally, I think the Chinese must have watched how the Ukrainians, without a conventional surface fleet, have wrecked the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The vulnerability of port facilities to precision weapons, the vulnerability of ships to unmanned maritime systems. Now, obviously, it's different operating in the Black Sea or Baltic Sea than it would be in the Pacific, but nonetheless, I think they will probably have paid close attention to that.
Yeah, and that would play a much larger role in any sort of Taiwan conflict than what's happening in Russia right now, just by the nature of the conflict. We've talked about the longer term strategic side of things. Two questions here. One, what do you see happening in the next few months? We're getting closer to offensive season in Ukraine, and what do you see going on from the military standpoint in Ukraine in the coming months? But then also, you talk about missing the boat on the ability to sort of reframe and change European security for the better moving forward. What do you mean when you talk about that? What does that look like in your mind?
Russia will never change until they're defeated. I mean, they have to be defeated. This is not a country that you can negotiate in good faith with and expect them to live up to any agreement. They've never, ever done it. This is not a reason for not. They've never done it unless you are there to force them to do it. When Reagan talked about trust but verify, if you don't have that, they never do it. So anybody that's so naive that thinks that if we can press Ukraine to negotiate, let Russia keep Crimea and the Donbass, and that Russia will be happy, that's all they wanted, is living a fairy tale, or has never looked at a map, or never read a history book. So this is the problem. So we need our policy, our strategy should be to help Ukraine actually win. And that's how you remove the threat against all of Europe, which is in our interest, since our biggest trading partner is not China, it's Europe, our biggest trading partner. And all of our best and most reliable allies come from Europe, as well as Canada and Australia. So we have to rediscover our strategic spine, let me say. Now, I think that 2024 is the year of industrial competition. I mean, everybody is looking for ammunition now. We're finally starting to put money into things that we should have done years ago, having to correct from mistakes made after the end of the Cold War. It is definitely ended the peace dividend. And so this means helping Ukraine regrow its defense industry. You've got several Western companies that are starting to set up and shop there with maintenance capabilities, for example, and ammunition production. But also Europe and the United States are starting to get their arms around ammunition. And the combined economies of Europe dwarf Russia. So there's no reason why we should not be producing mountains of ammunition for Ukraine. So it comes down to political will and us getting organized for victory. Now, on the battlefield, I think General Syrskyi, the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, his task is to stabilize the front, to buy time. I don't think that Russia has the ability to break through in any big way. There's not going to be some giant red arrow that goes all the way to Kyiv or something like that. I think it's going to be very dangerous around Kherson for a while. Russians are tearing it down block by block the way they did Grozny in Chechnya and the way they did Mariupol. I mean, that's what's happening there now. So in the absence of adequate air and missile defense, it's going to be hell for people. But on the ground, I don't see, even if Russia does launch some kind of a new offensive in May or June, as some people are starting to talk about, I think it's going to be more of what we're seeing right now. They don't have large armored divisions that are lurking behind the hills waiting to come forward. They have not really been able to exploit Avdiivka in I think it's almost 7 weeks now. They don't have that. I think General Syrskyi will do his best to stabilize the line, to buy time for this industrial buildup, but also they've got to grow the size of their army. They just changed the law lowering the draft age.
Yeah, like within the last week.
To 25. I was astounded.
Same here. I was like, that's what I was shocked that it was that high.
Yeah, they've got to fix that because they've got plenty of people. There's probably about 2 million Ukrainians that are military age males and females, men and women that could serve. But the government, not the army, the government's got to fix their personnel system, not only changing the laws, but also making it attractive so that young people believe that, okay, I won't get fed into this meat grinder until I'm properly trained, equipped, and in a unit. And they need more brigades so that they can rotate. Otherwise, these guys, they just get ground down.
All right, General Hodges, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us about the military aspects and strategy, tactics, and everything. This has been an interesting conversation. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you again to General Hodges for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This episode was produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett Dang. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.